For Parramatta.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to support the Public Service Amendment Bill 2023 to amend the Public Service Act 1999. Deputy Speaker, the Australian Public Service plays an essential role in assisting the government of the day and in supporting our communities. The public service is the policy engine which drives Australia forward. From education to health to social services and economics, our communities rely on the public service, and we are grateful to them for the work that they do. There is almost no institution more important in our democracy, Deputy Speaker, than our public service. They are the ballast in policy making. They are the people who formulate new ideas, give frank and fearless advice to the government that is responsible for policy development and policy implementation. And if you look around the world, Deputy Speaker, you see that those countries that have successful and strong public services are those countries that are themselves successful. It is an essential ingredient in a modern and successful democracy, the engine of reform and delivery for the people that every government in the world serves. Deputy Speaker, this government has shown its support for the public service. But unfortunately, that support and that gratitude that is provided on this side of the House is not shared by the former government and not shared on that side of the House. It's indeed unfortunate that this legislation is even needed today. Over nearly a decade, the Australian public service was gutted and its employees were neglected by those opposite. Let me give you some of the startling facts. The extent to which the public service was gutted and neglected over the course of the last term of government. Deputy Speaker, between 2013 and 2019, the number of public servants per 10,000 Australians fell from 69.78 to 56.7, a massive decline in the size of the public service in Australia, a gutting of the public service in many different departments and sections of our government. In many cases, a hollowing out of capability and replacing that capability with consultants and labour hire. And this began right back in 2013 with the Abbott government. The Abbott government embarked upon a war on the Australian public service, and in his brief 2 years in office took out 15,000 APS jobs. 15,000 APS jobs fewer over just 2 years of the Abbott government, shedding valuable public servants in so many areas. Now, there is nothing wrong with efficiency, Deputy Speaker. There's nothing wrong with ensuring that the public service is doing its job with the fewest number of people possible. But this is not what happened under the Abbott government. Under the Abbott government, the public service was systematically targeted and systematically gutted, to the tune of 15,000 APS jobs that came at the cost of services and came at the cost of policy development and delivery. Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government also showed contempt for the public service. They spent 70% of a $20 billion fund on outsourced service providers, a shadow workforce of 54,000 people, which they kept secret from the Australian people. A quarter of this fund was used for outsourced contractors and consultants. They attempted to cut $3.3 billion in a desperate attempt at budget repair in order to cut the public service. This was a government, Deputy Speaker, who attempted to sideline and neglect the public service. And the former Prime Minister, the member for Cook, would berate the public service, telling them that they live in the Canberra bubble, telling them that they exist in silos. He had the disrespect of referring to the bacon and eggs principle, saying that public servants didn't really have a stake in good policy design. He said, Deputy Speaker, that the public service should focus on implementation, not on policy development. That policy development was the job of politicians, and public servants should be responsible merely for implementation. What disrespect, Deputy Speaker, for this institution, which over centuries has provided frank and fearless advice. That is what they're there for, Deputy Speaker, to provide advice, to develop policy solutions, to propose them to governments. And it shows an incredible lack of self-knowledge to have the former government tell the public service that they'll take care of policy development and the public service should only focus on implementation. From a government that was focused on slogans and memes and polling to suggest that they were the source of all wisdom in policy development was an outrage and an insult to the Australian public service and to the people that they so loyally and capably serve. Another area, Deputy Speaker, where the former government showed contempt for the public service was in appointments. They consistently filled public service roles with former staffers, mates and cronies. Into Prime Minister and Cabinet, the top bureaucrat in the land, the Secretary of the Prime Minister's department. They put former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. And from there down into the public service, they made appointment after appointment on political grounds rather than merit grounds. What could be more destructive to the public service? What could be more demoralising to public servants than having those senior roles filled by mates of the Liberal Party rather than capable colleagues from across the public service who have worked their whole lives for the betterment of Australia? Tony Abbott waged a war on the public service, seeking to root out people who he deemed to be political people, people who he thought had served the Labor government or were too close to the Labor government. He put an axe through the senior ranks of the public service to purge it of people who he thought were insufficiently loyal to him. Again, a disastrous act, a disrespectful act, a loss of capability for the Australian public service, and a terrible message to give to loyal people who work hard for our community every day. Deputy Speaker, all of this, of course, brings us to the Robodebt scandal. And Australians will never forget Robodebt. In 2020, the member for Cook said of the public service that he wanted a laser-sharp focus on serving the quiet Australians. Yet, throughout his Prime Ministership, there were Australians crying out for help. They were not Australians who were served, they were Australians who were harmed. Over 400,000 victims, over 400,000 Australians, with $1.8 billion taken from them. Deputy Speaker, 2,000 people died after receiving their Robodebt advice from Centrelink. How many of these were the so-called quiet Australians? How many cries for help did the former government choose to hear and choose not to hear? How many people did they choose to ignore? Robodebt will forever remain a shameful chapter in our nation's story. A time when the government of the day targeted its most vulnerable citizens and wrecked the lives of thousands of people and their families. And that's why the Robodebt Royal Commission has been so important. The Robodebt Royal Commission heard from over 100 witnesses, from victims to public sector workers. We heard from Centrelink employees who tried raising concerns about the program but were ultimately ignored. Ignored by the philosophy of the former government, that the public service was there merely to implement, not to develop policy, not to advise. And the outcome of that dictum was very directly the Robodebt disaster. The Royal Commissioner, Catherine Holmes, described the scheme as both a crude and cruel mechanism, neither fair nor legal. It was a shameful chapter and, in her words, a costly failure of public administration in both human and economic terms. Well, the Royal Commission has been dismissed by those opposite as a witch hunt and has accused the Minister for Government Services and the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme of politicising the issue. He could not be more wrong. The Robodebt Royal Commission goes to the heart of our democracy and its hallowed institutions. The Robodebt Royal Commission shows what can happen when the public service is sidelined, ignored and denuded of its capability. The Robodebt Royal Commission shows us what we must never do again, and it motivates us to rebuild the public service and to support the public service. And the Royal Commission will go down in history as having exposed the sheer scale of neglect and apathy from the former government. And that's why this bill today is so important, Deputy Speaker. One of the key lessons of the 5-year Robodebt saga was the importance of integrity in government and ensuring a robust public service. The bill in front of us today presents an opportunity to renew the role of the Australian Public Service. Amending the Public Service Act 1999 is an important part of the Albanese government's agenda in reforming the Australian public service. And this bill has 4 fundamental areas of focus. First, to ensure that the APS embodies integrity. Second, to put people and businesses at the heart of the public service's work. Third, to ensure that the Australian Public Service is a model employer. And fourth, to ensure that the Australian Public Service has the capability to perform its work well. Currently, the public service operates under 5 core values: impartiality, commitment to service, accountability, respect and ethical operations. And this bill introduces a 6th value, the value of stewardship. Deputy Speaker, stewardship is about more than supervision. It's about building capability and institutional knowledge. It's about supporting the public interest and ensuring that the APS is future fit for its important work. Stewardship aims to strengthen the APS's core values and principles and encourage a culture of transparency and accountability. Time and again, the former government betrayed this principle. Whether it was the billions of dollars cut from hospitals in 2014, the neglect of public service advice over many years, the use of contractors, labour hire firms running rampant in the public service, the shadow workforce being built from contractors, all of that was exactly the opposite of stewardship. It was the antithesis of building capability and custodianship. And what we're suggesting is that we should reduce unnecessary hierarchy to create greater efficiency within the APS and give our respected employees a greater voice. Deputy Speaker, this bill will also require departments to conduct capability reviews every 5 years. This would involve an assessment of an organisation's strengths, areas for further development and medium and long-term risk analysis. And importantly, all these findings would be made public, consistent with the principle of transparency and accountability. We need to ensure that we restore public trust in the public service, trust which has eroded over the last decade of apathy and neglect. The amendment would reduce unnecessary hierarchy to empower our public service employees. And also made public would be the release of the agency's APS census results to instruct each agency to develop an action plan to continue to improve its capability and expertise into the future. Again, this is a key lesson from the Morrison government that this Albanese government is learning from and rising above: the importance of transparency and accountability. On top of stewardship, this bill strengthens the APS's core values. Amending the Public Service Act would require the APS to promote a new purpose statement, one which agency heads would be required to uphold in the long term. Deputy Speaker, this is a bill that recognises the importance of the public service in our democracy. It values them, It values the contribution they make to policy development and to policy implementation, and I commend it to the House.